what I'd like to do now is to just kind of put the spotlight on the filmmakers who were involved in the Fragment film for the moment. And then later invite some comment from the other panelists. And the question I have for the filmmakers in Fragment, well, many of you in your introductions, maybe all of you in your introductions, said that you were from your country, right? And the seminar or this forum that we have today really highlights the idea of a Southeast Asian cinema and what that could mean. What does Southeast Asia mean? What could a cinema mean in that context? But many of us obviously still identify very strongly with the countries we come from, the identities that are associated with our nations, the histories of those nations. And I guess in many ways, a sense that maybe some kind of style can be associated with our countries as well. This is not to say that each of us necessarily abides by those stylistic features of our country, but we may be responding or reacting to that category of our nation in a certain kind of way. And I would be interested, as I'm sure others would too, in how you actually relate yourself to this category of your country. You know, how do you think of yourself, maybe in stylistic terms or even in identity terms? Who are you as an artist, when you, especially as an independent filmmaker, right? When you associate yourself with your country. So perhaps, can we start with Khan?
So, I believe that you can't separate a person's personality and culture from the work that they do, especially, of course, in the area of art. So, for me, it's a maturing process, and it goes back to finding about my roots. So when I was young and I started wanting to make films, I just started from the level I was at, and I was pretty rootless. I think I feel that Singaporeans generally, because we grew up on a lot of, but then again, it probably is applicable for a lot of other nationalities as well, but Singaporeans in particular, we grew up on a diet of cultures from overseas. And so for me, I felt very rootless, but then I wasn't aware of it at the time, because that's all I ever knew. That was all I was ever aware of. So when I made my first few short films, it looked like the films I was watching at the time. And I didn't really think about my language or my culture, or like what SHERMAN mentioned, back several generations. I didn't even think it was important. And so the films, judging by its response, I knew that something was amiss. You know, just a very simple example, you do an action film in the streets, you know, and you do it seriously, you know, you're not trying to wing to the audience, you're trying to do a serious action film, and then you realize something is strange. So then I've traveled a little bit, and then I was able to see that this is not the case for the places that I was traveling. In Thailand, for example, you can have the big shopping malls with the mama papa shops, and then you get a real sense of the culture and the character of the place, of the language, the people. And then I begin to understand this term of being rootless, without roots. So, yeah, so I did what, you know, I think most of us would have thought of when you do cinema, which is think about language, think about your roots, right? Go back a few generations, and then you have to deal with all these things in your film. So do your actors speak in English, in Singlish? Do they speak with their mother tongue? Do they speak in broken mother tongue, or, you know, a formal classical mother tongue? So I'm still exploring these things. But that is very, very important, because you can't separate who we are from, you know, the work that we do.
Can I just follow up a little bit on that? And you describe a situation where you began with a sense of maybe rootlessness, but almost unconsciously so, right? I wonder if there is anything in that speaks to the Singapore condition. Is there something about Singapore that is different from elsewhere, which maybe provokes this sort of rootlessness?
Yeah, there are multiple examples of that. But one of it I can think of is that the policies in the last generation, the Lee Kuan Yew generation, they just came about, in the last 40, 50 years. And so that is where the beginning of it finds its start point. I mean, that's where it started. And so it's rather rootless. For example, we speak English, and my son, both my sons, I have two boys, and when they were of, I think maybe 2 or 3, they asked the same question. They were not aware, the younger one was aware that the elder asked this question, but they both asked this question at one point, which is that, if I'm Chinese, why am I speaking English? I think that sums it up. But then we are filmmakers I am a filmmaker who makes films, contemporary films. I can't have my Singaporean actors speaking Mandarin if they speak English as their first language. So that's an example of, something that is rootless. Don't know if I answered your question.
No, you did, definitely. Yeah. Thanks very much for that. I'm sure we'll have more to unpack there later, but let's maybe hear from Wesley.
For myself, I think I like to, when I approach my films, when making a film, I like to highlight issues in Singapore or things that I feel a little bit affected by. But in my films, I try to disguise them where my message is not too in your face. Sometimes it's disguised by humor or by the concept of the narrative. So for me, I do feel it's important to have some amount of Singaporeanness in the film for it to capture certain thoughts about what Singaporeans are thinking of at that point in time. So when we watch it like 20 years from now, and then we're like, oh, okay, I don't feel that way anymore, but I was thinking that 20 years ago. So but I think I don't really touch on like maybe politics or things like that. I'm slightly more, not say shallow, but I don't dig too deep, because it doesn't interest me too much. Yeah.
Great. If I can follow up on that, you said very many interesting things there. One is, well, at least I heard 2 things, right? One is that you said that you like to work with things that have affected you in some way, that you've taken notice of in Singapore. That's one aspect. And another aspect is you got to have something that's Singaporean in your films. Both could benefit from a bit more elaboration. So could you say a little bit more about what sort of things actually affect you, right? That you, in some ways or other, deal with in your films. They're not political, clearly, but what things do kind of connect with you or irritate you, annoy you, or excite you about Singapore?
For me, I try for my films to visually look like Singapore. I think I'm not the most, I'm not the kind of person who captures the most about Singapore. Like, people don't speak, I'm not capturing like the hawker center uncle. Yeah, so I don't really do that. But I think personally, I don't really respond much to films like, for example, if you're doing an action film set in Singapore, but it doesn't look like Singapore at all, or this film could have been done in any other country. So I personally don't respond well to those kind of films. I like films to look like, this is a film that could only exist in Singapore. These are the problems that could only come from Singapore.
Great, thanks very much. CHUI, what do you think?
I think I first maybe start to think about what type of country Malaysia is It was like 10 years ago in Rotterdam Film Festival. They have a Southeast Asian focus. And in that year, there were like maybe 5 Malaysian films. So we have U-WEI's Boy Laju Laju, which is set in Malay village. It's totally Malay cast in Malay language. We have James Lee Beautiful Washing Machine, set in like urban in KL, or in Mandarin, maybe some English, or Cantonese, or Chinese. And then I produced an Indian film by Deepak Kumara Menon, and it's set in like 60s Indian estate with all Indian in Tamil. And yeah, it's all in the same festival, and that was like quite new when the Malaysian film was like introduced to the European audience, and I actually start thinking, what would people think of Malaysia if they watch all 3? I forgot who are the other films, but these 3 are like from 3 different countries, like totally different. Yeah, it could be from 3 different countries, and I think that maybe make me ask like, what is Malaysia? And of course there are also some film that was made in English, but maybe not in that year. So it's quite strange. And I myself, I make like Chinese language film, which for me maybe sometimes they are a bit Taiwanese. And also most of my filmmaker friends, we have this sense of like being an outsider, like we don't feel like we belong in Malaysia. Or when I go to China, I feel like I don't belong to China. And it's just this thing like not belonging. And then like I have friends who just jokes like, we should claim our ancestry, just like you claim the culture that you like. And he said he is from Greek, ancient Greek, or something like that. I mean, you don't, just because you're born Chinese or you're born Malaysian doesn't mean your ancestor cannot be Greek. Although, of course, we don't know like Greek. Or I would like to claim my ancestry from India or something. So I guess at one point then you just don't care about the nationality, or yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you raised very many interesting points there, and I wonder if I can just poke you on one of them, right? I'm sure that there are others that will come up later on. So you were puzzled when you saw films that were being well, the language of the films were in non-Malay language, Chinese, Tamil, and so on and so forth, and you wondered to yourself how to reconcile that with the national sense of Malaysia, right? But Malaysia at least describes itself as a multi-racial, multicultural society. So how do you reconcile the two? How do you sort of, yeah.
No, I don't find it a problem, but I was quite intrigued by it. I don't think it's a problem, and maybe that's the beautiful thing of Malaysia, that it's all still quite different. I mean, yeah, that there still could be Tamil film being made, or like a Cantonese film, or I even hope there will be like Hakka film in the future. It's maybe also interesting, but it's just this nationality thing. Maybe I think for me it's not important if I'm Malaysian or not. But it's again, it's the same, like I tell people, I don't think it's important I'm a woman filmmaker or not, and I don't really like people like asking me question like, is it a disadvantage or no? It's not. That it doesn't mean like I'm a woman filmmaker, I should make topic about woman filmmaker, but I just cannot avoid people aware that I'm a woman filmmaker, that they will always associate like, yeah, she made this type of film because she's a woman. Or so I don't think I even need to think about making anything about Malaysia, but just because I'm Malaysian, it's very easily it's not something I will emphasize so much on the nationality or the gender or the ethnic group, or it's just because you are the creator, it will always have something to do with that. Yeah.
Great, thanks. But I will cheekily remind you that in your introduction, the one thing you told us about yourself was you're a Malaysian filmmaker.
Yeah, maybe I should also say I'm a Malaysian woman filmmaker.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. Sherman?
Actually, for me, I have a problem with this notion of Southeast Asia, because I think it's an economic. We start from ASEAN, and this the problem is where ASEAN lies, and also I think coming from Singapore and Malaysia, I think that these two countries have issues with acceptance of hybridity and diversity. Yeah, because of our colonial legacies, that we always have to put, like, this is a Chinese, Malay, Indian, and the fact that we call ourselves a multi-racial society, that is in effect creating divisions. And for me, that is a big problem, because I grew up being seen as, oh, these are the group of Chinese who are not Chinese. As a kid, so, oh, these are orang Cina bukan Cina. Then what does it mean? You know, what does it mean by that? You know, and because we don't speak Chinese. And then the first time I went to kindergarten, I realized that, hey, they look like me, but I couldn't understand a word that they speak, because we just don't speak. I mean, like, then I went home, I asked my parents at 5 years old, hey, how come I can't understand my classmates, but they look like me? And then slowly you then it was like you grew up with this kind of embarrassment that you have to identify yourself as Chinese, but you don't speak Chinese. Yeah, and then later on in life, you begin to see that there's so much diversity, much more than what the government at hand will want you to deal with, you know, because it's much easier to just categorize of how they use a British system to just plonk it down, and then the next government that takes over, and then you just follow the same categories. And I think Southeast Asia is so interesting because the interesting parts are the border areas, the borders like South Thailand and Malaysia, the borders between South Philippines and Sabah, and the borders between Aceh and Indonesia. I think those are the parts where it's more porous, when our identities are less clear. It's like the Balkans, you know. I mean, these are the places where perhaps we shouldn't be talking about Southeast Asia. Perhaps we should go back a bit more and look at what are the texts that have influenced maybe the island component of maritime Southeast Asia and the mainland Southeast Asia. I mean, I think Farishno mentioned that it's about the Mahayana and the Mahabharata, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and these are the two texts that have actually influenced these parts of the world. And then of course the politics of the world. I mean, we could have been Mafilindo, you know, if we had Philippines and Indonesia coming together. I mean, these three countries, ethnically, Nick would, ethnically the southern Filipinos are Malays. I mean, genetically they are Malays, yeah. And also and for us, because we are Peranakan, our language is closer to Indonesian. And in Malaysia, we speak the dialect that we speak in Malaysia as the national language is actually a Riau dialect. It's a dialect of perhaps Johor, betul tak? Yeah, because it was where UMNO was formed, and they used that way of speaking as speaking for the entire country. It's just the same like in China. They use Mandarin because it's the language of the north for the entire country. It's a language to unify. But I think Malaysia, the big problem was that during independence, it was just that they tolerate each other. They come together, but it's a tolerance. And now the problems we have there is because of this tolerance is breaking apart at the seams, because the three big parties that ask for independence just say, okay, we will get independence from the British, but we are just giving you your part of what you get, you see. And that's why the problem is not like, at some point I think I was quite envious with the way Indonesia does it, because it's really, you need someone like Sukarno to just, you know, like put something like that to change the entire society, which is why you have this kind of and also that affects the market, because right now the market, the film market in Malaysia is so fragmented, as opposed to like Indonesia or Thailand, where everybody speaks one language, and then that's also a big issue. Another area about language in films. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe
Wow, that's a whole bunch of things. Yeah, let me try and see if we can remember some of them. I suppose partly the question also is, knowing what you just said, right, yourself as an artist, that Southeast Asia as a region is extremely complex. I mean, basically it's that, right? The cultures or the hybrid cultures at the borderlands are extremely interesting, and they really escape many of the social categories that we
But
have.
actually not necessarily the hybrid, even the Pranakans, what we call the Pranakans here,
Yeah.
they are actually of hybrid culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you have not only the Chinese Pranakan, you have the Indian Pranakans. In Malacca, you have the Cheti, and then you have the Jawi. Jawi is like the Indian Muslim or Malay Pranakans.
So in fact, these hybrid formations are to be found even in the mainstream spaces, right? That's what you're saying. And then a lot of this
The Eurasians are also Pranakan.
Eurasians, that's right. I know this well, being one myself. But also, these spaces have been shaped by, again, you said, I think, colonial approaches to categorizing and managing and so on. And these colonial approaches are also not all the same, right? Because they were diverse colonial experiences in this region. So you have that sort of formation as well. But you also said something about what if you could have an authoritarian moment to establish some kind of uniformity, maybe one language or something that would make life easier and so on. So, I mean, these are quite, in a sense, contradictory positions that are difficult to figure out or to understand. But you as an artist, knowing all these things, right, how have you dealt with them in your own sort of artistic practice?
That's why when I make work, although I make my work in Singapore, but it's not about Singapore. Yeah, I make my works, they are always about Singapore in relation to the region, because of perhaps my family history, and because why, and I think to understand, I think we cannot look at Singapore as an isolation just as an island, because Singapore's role was so much more. Singapore was actually serving the region. That was why the British had put the focus here. And my ancestors, I mean, like my maternal side, they are from the Tan Kim Seng family. They moved from Malacca to Singapore because they knew these are business people. They were in opium trade. They were in arms. I mean, that's how they make the money, I think. Yeah, I mean, so these are business people. They know where is the next hot spot. So these are the places. Singapore was already a booming country. So the narrative of modern Singapore as a backwater is also a bit questionable in that sense. Singapore was already then, and if you look at the wheels of Tan Kim Seng, at that time in the 1800s, the prices of houses in Singapore was already 10 times the price in Malacca. So that Singapore, then you can't call Singapore as a backwater. Right? Singapore was a booming port 200, 300 years ago. So that was why I think when, as filmmakers, when we want to make a film about Singapore, we cannot just stick to just Singapore, like, you know, that for me, it's just not possible, because that is not how the DNA of the country was formed. You know, the DNA doesn't start 50 years ago. The DNA of this space has to start like maybe 500 years ago, and that's why then you begin to understand how this country can move. Yeah, because this country was kept afloat by Indonesian money, by Malaysian money, by Philippine money. I mean, that is part of the things that, to understand a space, you need to understand where the lifeline comes from. Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much.